Good RPGs are often extremely long, and we don't all have the time for that. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, the 10 best short RPGs you can't miss. Starting off with number 10, it's The Outer Worlds. If you like the gameplay of the Bethesda Fallout games but want something shorter, this is the best alternative. It was kind of advertised as Fallout in space, and that's pretty much what it is. It's a first-person RPG where you explore open environments, fight enemies, and talk to a lot of people. There's skill checks, there's loot to collect, and basically, if you know anything about the recent Fallout games, it's like that. But instead of being set in a huge open world like Fallout 3 and 4, each planet is its own zone that is relatively small, at least compared to that concept. The focus here is more on conversations and completing the quest, and not as much on side content. Because of the overall quality, though, it is absolutely, in terms of that kind of game, about as good as it gets. It is a much more focused experience, and how long to beat lists it as taking about 12 hours to finish. I think that's fairly accurate. If you go into this one expecting a sprawling world like a Fallout game, you might be disappointed, but if you're looking for something that will give you the feeling of those games and a great story and lore and characters and all that, this is a really good pick. At number 9 is Mass Effect. Now, the original Mass Effect is super interesting. It is a game that can take dozens of hours to finish if you want to pour a lot of time in it, but it can also easily be completed in under 5 hours. Now, created by BioWare, the original Mass Effect is this janky, awkward, and sometimes frustrating game, but it's also a really good RPG, and in some ways a better RPG than its more polished sequels. It is an RPG at heart. You've got a party with a lot of special abilities, you've got conversation trees, you have a story with a lot of branching paths. Being BioWare's first attempt at a shooting game, the combat mechanics can feel a little rough, but once you start combining powers and making use of your teammates, the whole thing gets actually very satisfying. The story is fairly simple, but the world building in this game is just fantastic. That's essentially what made this a thing. It certainly wasn't the rudimentary mechanics that did get better over the course of the series. It was really the story, the world, and all the cool aliens, as well as all of the history that you see. Though Mass Effect 2 is usually considered the best game of the series, the original is still really good and worth playing, especially with the Legendary Edition, which definitely smooths out some of those rough corners. Like we said a minute ago, the actual length of the game can vary pretty widely, but if you simply play through the main story and the relevant quests, it's not hard to finish this game in under 10 hours, and on replays, you'll find yourself being able to finish it in like 4 or 5 hours. At number 8 is South Park: The Stick of Truth. Remember when South Park made an RPG and it was actually really good? This game can be finished in around 10 hours, but don't let that make you think that you'll be shortchanged. It's a lot of fun to play, and if you're even a mild fan of the South Park series, you will enjoy it. It was developed by Obsidian Entertainment, you know, the Fallout New Vegas / Outer Worlds guys. But this game has you entering the world of South Park, where you play a new kid in school who gets involved in this giant LARP where all the South Park kids are playing wizards and warriors. It's basically an excuse to make jokes about role-playing games, but unlike a lot of other terrible parody games, this one's actually fun. It's got a really good old-school JRPG style system with a few twists, but you can wander around South Park, talk to various characters, and collect a lot of useless junk as loot. The short length makes it so the humor doesn't overstay its welcome too, and it remains pretty consistently hilarious through the whole thing. The sequel, The Fractured But Whole, you gotta be careful the way you say it, parodies superheroes rather than high fantasy, but the gameplay remains mostly the same. Even though the sequel's not made by Obsidian, it's still worth checking out, though it's a little bit longer, and for all intents and purposes, The Stick of Truth is also a little bit better.
You entered douchebag, is that correct? Are you sure you want to keep the name douchebag? Very well, douchebag.
At number 7 is Fable, or Fable Anniversary. The original Fable is the shortest in the series, clocking in at only around 12 hours, and it's still probably the best of the three, even though it didn't live up to the ridiculous hype of the time. Remember the whole plant a tree and watch it grow in real time thing? Yeah. That doesn't mean it isn't a great game. Story's about as basic as it gets. You play a dude whose village was destroyed in a bandit attack, you join the Heroes Guild, and you got tasks, basically. Do hero stuff. What makes the game unique was how what you did would affect your character's appearance. Like, if you were good, you would look more angelic. If you were evil, you'd grow devil horns, stuff like that. Depending on how you look, people would react differently to you, and you'd get new options as to how to interact in the world. There aren't a lot of side quests, and the world's relatively small, but it's really dense, and it's just fun to screw around with. Like, you can literally go around town and fart on people. And there's other ways to generally cause trouble, but that is just primo. The gameplay's fairly basic, but it's fun enough, and it looks pretty great if you have the Anniversary Edition remake that came out back in 2014. At number 6 is Shadowrun Returns, the first of 3 new Shadowrun games released by Harebrained Schemes. It's definitely the shortest. It comes in at about 12 hours, and the 2 games after it are definitely the better all-around games, but it's still worth playing. If you're not familiar with Shadowrun, it's basically cyberpunk combined with fantasy, and it's really fun. You basically get all the cyberpunk staples like a dystopian future, tough guys with katanas, cyborgs, hackers, all that stuff, but it's also got trolls and elves and dragons, and oh yeah, you can be a shaman. It might sound silly, but before Cyberpunk 2077, Shadowrun was basically the premier cyberpunk setting, and this game is a great introduction to it. It's set in Seattle, but the main plot has you hunting down the Emerald City Ripper, a serial killer that unsurprisingly isn't just some random killer, and there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. The story's actually not bad, I just think it's funny to talk like that. Gameplay mostly involves taking missions and getting into tactical combat encounters that play out a lot like the Firaxis XCOM games. Gameplay is much more straightforward in this one than the sequels. Those are closer to what you'd expect from a top-down RPG, while this one doesn't give you quite as many choices or options. Honestly, all 3 of the Shadowrun games are really worth playing. The sequels clock in around 20 hours each, so they aren't that long, but this one's definitely the shortest, and of course it being the first in the trilogy, it's a good starting point if you're interested. At number 5 is Undertale. We can't mention short RPGs without mentioning Undertale, the indie sensation that took your standard RPG tropes and turned them all on their head. A single playthrough can be finished in about 4 hours. I mean, you're probably gonna take a little bit longer, maybe 6.5, but if you know what you're doing, 4. And it's also relatively cheap at about $10 on most platforms. The story's super basic. You play as a kid who's fallen into the underground world full of monsters, and you need to find a way out. The actual story is super linear, but it's filled with charming and goofy characters, and the developers constantly added new twists to battles to keep things entertaining. But it's that, specifically, that makes the game unique. It might look like standard RPG battles at first, but it's really more of an action game where you have to physically dodge enemy attacks. It's very weird, and that explanation does not do it justice. It's much more intuitive, and really it is very fun. There's also a lot of replayability because there's a ton of different endings, most of which come down to if you choose to kill or spare enemies. There is a reason this one got so popular, and it's not just the memes, it's just a really cool, short game that people get through and love. And number 4 is Parasite Eve. Now, when you think of the PS1, you probably think of all of its RPGs, like Final Fantasy VII, Xenogears, Legend of Dragoon, and those are all massive RPGs, but this one, called Parasite Eve, can be finished in about 7 hours. It was made by Square before they became Square Enix, and it was probably during their most productive period. Like, this is a super unusual game. It's kind of a combination of RPG and survival horror. If you remember when this game came out, and I am that old, it seemed like it was a Resident Evil competitor, but then when you played it, it was like an RPG. It's really an interesting combo that is a lot of fun to play, as long as you don't mind the blocky PS1 graphics. The story follows an NYPD officer named Aya Bray, who's trying to stop the monster Eve, a creature that can make people spontaneously combust, as well as transform them into some pretty gnarly monsters. Like I said, you really wouldn't think it was an RPG just looking at it, but it's got this real-time pause battle system with special abilities and items. There's also a weapon upgrading system that's pretty in-depth, and all in all, it's a really surprisingly fun game to come back to. Now, it's super short for an RPG. Maybe it was kind of a proof of concept that got fleshed out into a full thing, and it is also very linear due to that, but it's a well-made game that is super worth checking out. It's a game I would love to see a remake to be completely honest, and not like a remake that totally changes everything about it, but a remake that just gives it better graphics and maybe voice acting. Oh yeah, and even though it's a survival horror game on the PS1, it does not have tank control, so that's beyond nice. And number 3 is Child of Light. Now, this is a very unusual side-scrolling RPG with a fairy tale aesthetic created by Ubisoft Montreal. It's relatively short, about 11 hours. They managed to squeeze a ton into it, but it's got this really good kind of Grandia-esque battle system with multiple party members. It's got a full story. It's got rhyming dialogue, which is kind of weird, but it's got a storybook aesthetic, so it kind of works. It didn't bother me, but I did always go like, it's rhyming. All right, we get it. What really stands out, though, is the presentation. It looks like a watercolor painting come to life, and even 7 years after its release, it is a uniquely beautiful game. Like, to get the most out of the combat, though, I'm going to go ahead and say play it on a harder difficulty because it's a really well-designed battle system, and it adds some hours to your game time. At the end of the day, it's about 11 hours, give or take, but it wastes absolutely none of that time, and it's just this really great fusion of art and gameplay. And number 2 is Alpha Protocol, which is a role-playing spy game that was really looked over. Like, just, what? A role-playing spy game? Also, the name is kind of meh. Honestly, it sounds a little cheap. But it is actually a unique and really fun game that does tons with its premise. You play as Michael Thornton, a new recruit to a secret Black Ops agency called Alpha Protocol. As an agent, you can sneak, you can shoot, you can walk, you can talk. There's tons of different scenarios, but what makes the game interesting is how your actions affect the story. A whole lot can change depending on what order you take your missions in and what choices you make in them. Even though you play as a set character, basically like Shepard from Mass Effect, you can edit their features and play them very differently depending on how you allocate your points and how you choose to react to certain situations. The actual gameplay itself can be a little stiff and awkward. It's definitely more of an RPG than an action game, and that might take a little bit of getting used to, but once you get there, it is at least playable. I know that's not like high praise or anything, but just dump all your points into pistols your first run and thank us later. The game only takes about 13 hours to finish, and depending on your playstyle, it can even be a lot less. Still, it doesn't feel incredibly short. It is a very fast-paced game. And finally, very last, it's Chrono Trigger. Now, this one's a little longer than most of the games on this list, clocking in at about 15 to 17 hours for a casual playthrough, but we have to mention it, it's probably the most famous short RPG of all time, for good reasons. There's not a lot that hasn't already been said about this game. It's a 1995 SNES RPG created by Square. It's probably one of the most popular and highly reviewed RPGs of all time, and on top of that, it's fairly short. For many, that is why it's so good. Instead of being this massive, sprawling game with a lot of repetition like many RPGs from its day, this game was fast-paced and constantly mixing things up. You're never in one place for too long. Like, this time-spanning adventure is always carting you off to some new time and place before things get stale. It's the game's pacing that makes it so unique, especially for when it came out. It's also got amazing music, simple, fun gameplay. It's not exactly modern, but in my opinion, and a lot of others' opinions, it still holds up, and it's not too hard to find. Just do not play the PlayStation 1 version. The load times absolutely just end it. It is not fun anymore. What's your favorite short RPG? Is it on this list? Is it another one? Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of this week and any other week. So click subscribe and don't forget to enable notifications. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at FalconTheHero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.